Verb. A verb, from Latin verbum word, is part of speech that in syntax generally conveys an action: bring, read, walk, run, learn, an occurrence, happen, become, or a state of being, be, exist, stand. In the usual description of English, the basic form, with or without the particle to, is the infinitive. In many languages, verbs are inflected, modified in form, to encode tense, aspect, mood, and voice. A verb may also agree with the person, gender, and number of some of its arguments, such as its subject or object. In English, three tenses exist: present, to indicate that an action is being carried out; past, to indicate that an action has been done; future, to indicate that an action will be done, expressed with the auxiliary verb will or shall. For example, Lucy will go to school. Action, future. Barack Obama became the President of the United States in 2009. Occurrence, past, Mike Trout as a center fielder. State of being, present. Every language covered so far makes some form of noun-verb distinction, one possibly because of the graph-like nature of communicated meaning by humans, i.e. nouns being the entities, and verbs being the links between them. 2. Agreement. In languages where the verb is inflected, it often agrees with its primary argument, the subject, in person, number, or gender. With the exception of the verb to be, English shows distinctive agreements only in the third-person singular, present tense form of verbs, which are marked by adding s, walks, or s, fishes. The rest of the persons are not distinguished in the verb I walk, you walk, they walk, etc. Latin and the Romance languages inflect verbs for tense, aspect, mood, abbreviated dam, and they agree in person and number, but not in gender, as for example in Polish with the subject. Japanese, like many languages with SOV word order, inflects verbs for tense, aspect, mood, as well as other categories such as negation, but shows absolutely no agreement with the subject. It is a strictly dependent marking language. On the other hand, Basque, Georgian, and some other languages have polypersonal agreement. The verb agrees with the subject, the direct object, and even the secondary object if present. A greater degree of head marking than is found in most European languages. Types. Verbs vary by type, and each type is determined by the kinds of words that accompany it and the relationship those words have with the verb itself. Classified by the number of their valency arguments, usually 4 basic types are distinguished: intransitives, transitive, detransitives, and double transitive verbs. Some verbs have special grammatical uses and hence complements, such as copular verbs, i.e., be, the verb to use for do, support in questioning and negation, and tense or aspect auxiliaries, e.g., be, have, or can. In addition, verbs can be non-finite, not inflected for person, number, tense, etc., such special forms as infinitives, participles, or gerunds. 3. Intransitive verbs. An intransitive verb is one that does not have a direct object. Intransitive verbs may be followed by an adverb, a word that addresses how, where, when, and how often, or end a sentence. For example, the woman spoke softly. The athlete ran faster than the official. The boy wept. Transitive verbs. A transitive verb is followed by a noun or noun phrase. These noun phrases are not called predicate nouns, but are instead called direct objects because they refer to the object that is being acted upon. For example, my friend read the newspaper. The teenager earned a speeding ticket. A way to identify a transitive verb is to invert the sentence, making it passive. For example, the newspaper was read by my friend. A speeding ticket was earned by the teenager. Detransitive verbs. Detransitive verbs, sometimes called VG verbs after the verb give, precede either two noun phrases or a noun phrase and then a prepositional phrase often led by 2 or 4. For example, the players gave their teammates high fives. The players gave high fives to their teammates. When 2 noun phrases follow a transitive verb, the first is an indirect object, that which is receiving something, and the second is a direct object, that being acted upon. Indirect objects can be noun phrases or prepositional phrases. 4. Double transitive verbs. Double transitive verbs, sometimes called VC verbs after the verb consider, are followed by a noun phrase that serves as a direct object and then a second noun phrase, adjective, or infinitive phrase. The second element, noun phrase, adjective, or infinitive, is called a complement, which completes a clause that would not otherwise have the same meaning. For example, the young couple considers the neighbor's wealthy people. Some students perceive adults quite inaccurately. Sarah deemed her project to be the hardest she has ever completed. Copular verbs. Copular verbs, aka. Linking verbs, include be, seem, become, appear, look, and remain. For example, her daughter was a writing tutor. The singers were very nervous. His mother looked worried. Josh remained a reliable friend. These verbs precede nouns or adjectives in a sentence, which become predicate nouns and predicate adjectives. 5. Copular thought to link, the predicate adjective or noun to the subject. They can also be followed by an adverb of place, which is sometimes referred to as a predicate adverb. For example, my house is down the street. The main verb be is manifested in 8 forms: be, is, am, are, was, were, been, and being in English. Valency. The number of arguments that a verb takes is called its valency or valence. Verbs can be classified according to their valency. Avalent valency equals O. The verb has neither a subject nor an object. Zero valency does not occur in English. In some languages such as Mandarin Chinese, whether verbs like snows take no subject or object. Intransitive valency equals 1. Monovalent, the verb only has a subject. For example, he runs, it falls. Transitive valency equals 2. Divalent, the verb has a subject and a direct object. For example, she eats fish, we hunt nothing. Transitive valency equals 3. Trivalent, the verb has a subject, a direct object, and an indirect object. For example, he gives her a flower, or she gave John the watch. A few English verbs, particularly those concerned with financial transactions, take 4 arguments, as in, Pat 1 sold Chris 2 a lawnmower 3 for $204 inches, or Chris 1 paid Pat $2.203 for a lawnmower 4 inches. 6. Impersonal and objective verbs. Whether verbs often appear to be impersonal, subjectless, or avalent in null subject languages like Spanish, where the verb llueve means, it rains. In English, French, and German, they require a dummy pronoun and therefore formally have a valency of 1. As verbs in Spanish incorporate the subject as a tam suffix, Spanish is not actually a null subject language, unlike Mandarin, see above. Such verbs in Spanish also have a valency of 1. Intransitive and transitive verbs are the most common, but the impersonal and objective verbs are somewhat different from the norm. In the objective, the verb takes an object but no subject. The non-referent subject in some uses may be marked in the verb by an incorporated dummy pronoun similar to that used with the English weather verbs. Impersonal verbs in null subject languages take neither subject nor object, as is true of other verbs, but again the verb may show incorporated dummy pronouns despite the lack of subject and object phrases. Valency marking. Verbs are often flexible with regard to valency. In non-valency marking languages such as English, a transitive verb can often drop its object and become intransitive, or an intransitive verb can take an object and become transitive. For example, in English the verb move has no grammatical object and he moves, though in this case, the subject itself may be an implied object, also expressible explicitly as in he moves himself, but in he moves the car, the subject and object are distinct and the verb has a different valency. Some verbs in English have historically derived forms that show change of valency in some causative verbs, such as fall, fell, fallen, fell, felled, rise, rose, risen, raise, raised, raised, cost, costed, costed. In valency marking languages, valency change is shown by inflecting the verb in order to change the valency. In Kalalagaya of Australia, for example, verbs distinguish valency by argument agreement suffixes and tam endings. Nui manjma, he arrived earlier today, manjma today past singular subject active intransitive perfective. Palai manjmanu, they dual arrived earlier today. Tana manjmanu, they plural arrived earlier today. Verb structure, mangai number tam, arrive plus active plus singular dual plural plus tam. Nui wapi manganu, he took the fish to that place. Active voice. Active voice is a grammatical voice prevalent in many of the world's languages. It is the default voice for clauses that feature a transitive verb in nominative accusative languages, including English and most Indo-European languages. In these languages, a verb is typically in the active voice when the subject of the verb is the doer of the action. In active voice, the subject of the sentence performs the action expressed by the main verb and is thus the agent. For example, in the sentence, the cat ate the fish, the cat is the agent performing the action of eating. 1. This contrasts with the passive voice, where the subject is the recipient of the action, such as in, the fish was eaten by the cat. The use of both active and passive voices in languages enhances versatility in sentence construction, allowing either the semantic agent or patient to assume the syntactic role of the subject. 2. Even in sentences with impersonal verbs, where no agent is specified, the verb form remains active, such as, it rains. Examples. Below are examples demonstrating the active and passive voices with pairs of sentences using the same transitive verb across various languages. Die Hund had die Pasvod gebet. Die Pasvod is der die Hund gebet. De Hund beat de Postbesorder. De Postbesorder word gebet in door de Hund. Add. Alkalbo. Saya. Alberry. The dog bit the postal carrier. The postal carrier was bitten by the dog. English. The dog bit the postal carrier. The postal carrier was bitten by the dog. Dutch. The dog bit the postal carrier. The postal carrier was bitten by the dog. Arabic. The dog bit the postal carrier. The postal carrier was bitten by the dog. French. The dog bit the postal carrier. The postal carrier was bitten by the dog. German. The dog bit the postal carrier. The postal carrier was bitten by the dog. Italian. The dog bit the postal carrier. The postal carrier was bitten by the dog. Latin. The dog bit the postman. The postman was bitten by the dog. Korean. A dog bit the postal carrier. The postal carrier was bitten by a dog. Japanese. Passive voice. A passive voice construction is a grammatical voice construction that is found in many languages. 1. In a clause with passive voice, the grammatical subject expresses the theme or patient of the main verb, that is, the person or thing that undergoes the action or has its state changed. 2. This contrasts with active voice, in which the subject has the agent role. For example, in the passive sentence, the tree was pulled down, the subject the tree denotes the patient rather than the agent of the action. In contrast, the sentences, someone pulled down the tree, and, the tree is down, are active sentences. Typically, in passive clauses, what is usually expressed by the object or sometimes another argument of the verb is now expressed by the subject, while what is usually expressed by the subject is either omitted or is indicated by some adjunct of the clause. Thus, turning an active sense of a verb into a passive sense is a valence decreasing process, detransitivizing process, because it syntactically turns a transitive sense into an intransitive sense. 3. This is not always the case. For example, in Japanese a passive voice construction does not necessarily decrease valence. 4. Many languages have both an active and a passive voice. This allows for greater flexibility in sentence construction, as either the semantic agent or patient may take the syntactic role of subject. 5. The use of passive voice allows speakers to organize stretches of discourse by placing figures other than the agent in subject position. This may be done to foreground the patient, recipient, or other thematic role. 5. It may also be useful when the semantic patient is the topic of ongoing discussion. 6. The passive voice may also be used to avoid specifying the agent of an action. Passive marking. Different languages use various grammatical forms to indicate passive voice. In some languages, passive voice is indicated by verb conjugation, specific forms of the verb. Examples of languages that indicate voice through conjugation include Greek, Latin, and North Germanic languages such as Swedish. Voice Latin Swedish meaning. Passive vinum a servo portatur. Vinit bars avenue generin. The wine is carried by the waiter. Active service vinum portat. Generin bar vinit. The waiter carries the wine. Norwegian, Nynorsk, and Icelandic have a similar system, but the usage of the passive is more restricted. The passive forms in Nynorsk are restricted to being accompanied by an auxiliary verb, which is not the case in Swedish and Danish. Nynorsk uses a vert or a bli plus past participle for passive voice. In English, English, like some other languages, uses a periphrastic passive. Rather than conjugating directly for voice, English uses the past participle form of the verb plus an auxiliary verb, either be or get called linking verbs in traditional grammar to indicate passive voice. The money was donated to the school. The vase got broken during the fight. All men are created equal. If the agent is mentioned, it usually appears in a prepositional phrase introduced by the preposition by. Without agent, the paper was marked. With agent, the paper was marked by Mr. Tan. The subject of the passive voice usually corresponds to the direct. The vase got broken during the fight. All men are created equal. If the agent is mentioned, it usually appears in a prepositional phrase introduced by the preposition by. Without agent, the paper was marked. With agent, the paper was marked by Mr. Tan. Subject of the passive voice usually corresponds to the direct object of the corresponding active voice formulation, as in the above examples, but English also allows passive constructions in which the subject corresponds to an indirect object or preposition complement. We were given tickets. Subject we corresponds to the indirect object of give. Tim was operated on yesterday. Subject Tim corresponds to the complement of the preposition on. In sentences of the second type, a stranded preposition is left. This is called the prepositional passive or pseudo-passive, although the latter term can also be used with other meanings. The active voice is the dominant voice used in English. Many commentators, notably George Orwell in his essay, Politics in the English Language, and Strunkenwhite in the Elements of Style, have urged minimizing use of the passive voice, but this is almost always based on these commentators' misunderstanding of what the passive voice is. 8. Contrary to common critiques, the passive voice has important uses, with virtually all writers using the passive voice, including Orwell and Strunkenwhite. 9. There is general agreement that the passive voice is useful for emphasis or when the receiver of the action is more important than the actor. 10. Merriam-Webster's Dictionary of English Usage refers to 3 statistical studies of passive versus active sentences in various periodicals, stating, the highest incidence of passive constructions was 13%. Orwell runs to a little over 20% in Politics in the English Language. Clearly he found the construction useful in spite of his advice to avoid it as much as possible. 10. Defining passive. In the field of linguistics, the term passive is applied to a wide range of grammatical structures. Linguists therefore find it difficult to define the term in a way that makes sense across all human languages. The canonical passive in European languages has the following properties. 1. The subject is not an agent. 2. There is a change in word order, or in nominal morphology, the form of the nouns in the sentence. 3. There is specific verbal morphology, a particular form of the verb indicates passive voice. The problem arises with non-European languages. Many constructions in these languages share at least one property with the canonical European passive, but not all. While it seems justified to call these constructions passive when comparing them to European languages' passive constructions, as a whole the passives of the world's languages do not share a single common feature. One 255. Apart from natural state B, moldy get eind, INTR3SG, that beautiful piece of dry fish got mold. 13. Fish departed from nat. 13. Stative and dynamic passive. In some languages, for example English, there is often a similarity between clauses expressing an action or event in the passive voice and clauses expressing a state. For example, the string of words, the dog is fed, can have the following 2 different meanings. 1. The dog is fed twice a day. 2. The dog is fed so we can leave now. The additions in parentheses force the same string of words to clearly show only one of their 2 possible grammatical functions in the related meaning. In the first sentence, the combination of the auxiliary verb, is, and the past participle, fed, is a regular example of the construction of the passive voice in English. In the second sentence, is, can however be interpreted as an ordinary copula and the past participle as an adjective. Sentences of the second type are called false passives by some linguists, who feel that such sentences are simply confused with the passive voice due to their outward similarity. Other linguists consider the second type to be a different kind of passive, a stative passive rarely called statal, static, or resultative passive in contrast to the dynamic or eventive passive illustrated by the first sentence. Some languages express or can express these different meanings using different constructions. The difference between dynamic and stative passives is more evident in languages such as German that use different words or constructions for the 2. 14. In German, the auxiliary verb sign marks static passive German, Zustands passive, rarely statisches passive, in referring to German also called sign passive or sign passive, while word marks the dynamic passive Vorgangs passive or Handlungs passive, rarely dynamisches passive, in referring to German also called word in passive or word in passive or simply passive or passivum. 50. The English string of words, the lawn is mown, has 2 possible meanings corresponding to the example, the dog is fed, above. It can be used in the following 2 different senses. 1. Dynamic, the lawn is mown once a week. 2. Stative, the lawn is mown so they're probably not gone. German uses 2 different grammatical constructions for these sentences. 1. Dynamic, der Rasenwort einmal pro Woche gemmet. 2. Stative, der Rasen ist gemmet also since I wahrscheinlich nicht verreist. FN1. Further examples and explanations. 1. Dynamic, der Rasenwort gerade off gemmet, the lawn is being mown right now, the lawn is mown often, literally, the lawn gets mown right now often, dynamic. 2. Stative, der Rasen ist schon gemmet, the lawn is already mown. A number of German verbs such as bedeck and cover, or fill and fill, and trennen separate, when used as stative verbs, usually only form static passives. Schneebedeck die Erde, snow covers the ground, active die Erde ist mit Schneebedeck, the ground is covered with snow, static, rare, poetic. Subject grammar. A subject is one of the two main parts of a sentence, the other being the predicate, which modifies the subject. For the simple sentence John runs, John is the subject, a person or thing about whom a statement is made. Traditionally the subject is the word or phrase which controls the verb in the clause, that is to say with which the verb agrees. John is but John and Mary are. If there is no verb, as in Nicola, what an idiot, or if the verb has a different subject, as in John, I can't stand him, then John is not considered to be the grammatical subject, but can be described as the topic of the sentence. While these definitions apply to simple English sentences, defining the subject is more difficult in more complex sentences and languages. For example, in the sentence it is difficult to learn French, the subject seems to be the word it, and yet arguably the real subject, the thing that is difficult, is to learn French. A sentence such as it was John who broke the window is more complex still. Sentences beginning with a locative phrase, such as there is a problem, isn't there, in which the tag question isn't there, seems to imply that the subject is the adverb there, also create difficulties for the definition of subject. 1. In languages such as Latin and German the subject of a verb has a form which is known as the nominative case. For example, the form he, not him, or his is used in sentences such as he ran, he broke the window, he is a teacher, he was hit by a motorist. But there are some languages such as Basque or Greenlandic, in which the form of a noun or pronoun when the verb is intransitive, he ran, is different from when the verb is transitive, he broke the window. In these languages, which are known as ergative languages, the concept of subject may not apply at all. Technical definition. The subject glossing abbreviations, sub or su, is, according to a tradition that can be traced back to Aristotle and that is associated with phrase structure grammars, one of the two main constituents of a clause, the other constituent being the predicate, whereby the predicate says something about the subject. 2. 3. According to a tradition associated with predicate logic and dependency grammars, the subject is the most prominent overt argument of the predicate. By this position all languages with arguments have subjects, though there is no way to define this consistently for all languages. 4. Even in languages such as English, there is not always a perfect match between the semantic predicate and the subject, as a predicate may be predicated on an argument in another clause, see raising. From a functional perspective, a subject is a phrase that conflates nominative case with the topic. Many languages, such as those with ergative or Austronesian alignment, do not do this, and by this definition would not have subjects. All of these positions see the subject determining person and number agreement on the finite verb, as exemplified by the difference in verb forms between he eats and they eat. The stereotypical subject immediately precedes the finite verb in declarative sentences and represents an agent or a theme. The subject is often a multi-word constituent and should be distinguished from parts of speech, which, roughly, classify words within constituents. In the example sentences below, the subjects are indicated in boldface. 1. The dictionary helps me find words. 2. Strangely enough, ice cream appeared on the table. 3. The man who was sitting over there told me that he just bought a ticket to Tahiti. 4. Nothing else is good enough. 5. That nothing else is good enough shouldn't come as a surprise. 6. To eat 6 different kinds of vegetables a day is healthy. 7. Despite her objections, he sold us 10 bags of clothes. Forms of the subject. The subject is a constituent that can be realized in numerous forms, many of which are listed in the following table. Noun phrase or pronoun the large car stopped outside our house. A gerund phrase his constant hammering was annoying. A to infinitive phrase to read is easier than to write. A folded clause that he had traveled the world was known to everyone. A free relative clause whatever he did was always of interest. A direct quotation I love you is often heard these days. 0 but implied subject take out the trash. An expletive it is raining. A cataphoric it was known to everyone that he had traveled the world. A preposition phrase after lunch is too late. Criteria for identifying subjects. There are several criteria for identifying subjects. 5. 1. Subject-verb agreement. The subject agrees with the finite verb in person and number, e.g. I am versus I is. 6. 2. Position occupied. The subject typically immediately precedes the finite verb in declarative clauses, e.g. Tom laughs. 3. Semantic role. A typical subject in the active voice is an agent or theme, i.e. it performs the action expressed by the verb or when it is a theme, it receives a property assigned to it by the predicate. These 3 criteria. The first one, agreement, is the most reliable. The subject agrees with the finite verb in person and number, and sometimes in gender as well. The second and third criterion are merely strong tendencies that can be flouted in certain constructions, e.g. 1. Tom is studying chemistry. The 3 criteria agree identifying Tom as the subject. 2. Is Tom studying chemistry? The first and the third criteria identify Tom as the subject. 3. Chemistry is being studied by Tom. The first and the second criteria identify chemistry as the subject. In the first sentence, all 3 criteria combine to identify Tom as the subject. In the second sentence, which involves the subject auxiliary inversion of a yes-no question, the subject immediately follows the finite verb instead of immediately preceding it, which means the second criterion is flouted. And in the third sentence expressed in the passive voice, the first and the second criterion combine to identify chemistry as the subject, whereas the third criterion suggests that by Tom should be the subject because Tom is an agent. 4. Morphological case. In languages that have case systems, the subject is marked by a specific case, often the nominative. 5. Omission. Many languages systematically omit a subject that is known in discourse. The fourth criterion is better applicable to other languages, the exception being the subject and object forms of pronouns, I, me, he, him, she, her, they, them. The fifth criterion is helpful in languages that typically drop pronominal subjects, such as Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Latin, Greek, Japanese, and Mandarin. Though most of these languages are rich in verb forms for determining the person and number of the subject, Japanese and Mandarin have no such forms at all. This dropping pattern does not automatically make a language a pro-drop language. In other languages, like English and French, most clauses should have a subject, which should be either a noun phrase, a pronoun, or a clause. This is also true when the clause has no element to be represented by it. This is why verbs like rain must have a subject such as it, even if nothing is actually being represented by it. In this case, it is an expletive and a dummy pronoun. In imperative clauses, most languages ally the subject, even in languages which typically requires a subject to be present, e.g. Give it to me. Coordinated sentences. One criterion for identifying a subject in various languages is the possibility of its omission in coordinated sentences such as the following. 7. The man hit the woman and the man came here. In a passive construction, the patient becomes the subject by this criterion. The woman was hit by the man and the woman came here. In ergative languages such as the nearly extinct Australian language gerbil, in a transitive sentence it is the patient rather than the agent that can be omitted in such sentences. Balan di ugumble bagilyara gubalgan, banani you the man by yara, hit the woman balan di ugumble, and she came here. This suggests that in ergative languages of this kind the patient is actually the subject in a transitive sentence. Difficult cases. There are some constructions that challenge the criteria just introduced for identifying subjects. The following subsections briefly illustrate 3 such cases. 1. Existential constructions, 2. Inverse copular constructions, and 3. Locative inversion constructions. Existential constructions. Existential constructions allow for varying interpretations about what should count as the subject, e.g. 1. There are problems. 2. There are problems. In sentence 1, the first criterion, agreement, and the second criterion, position occupied, suggests that there is the subject, whereas the third criterion, semantic role, suggests rather that problems is the subject. In sentence 2, in contrast, agreement and semantic role suggest that problems is the subject, whereas position occupied suggests that there is the subject. In such cases then, one can take the first criterion as the most telling, the subject should agree with the finite verb. 8. Inverse copular constructions. Another difficult case for identifying the subject is the so-called inverse copular constructions, e.g. 9. 1. The boys are a chaotic force around here. 2. A chaotic force around here is the boys. Inverse copular construction. The criteria combine to identify the boys as the subject in sentence 1. But if that is the case, then one might argue that the boys is also the subject in a similar sentence too, even though 2 of the criteria, agreement and position occupied, suggest that a chaotic force around here is the subject. When confronted with such data, one has to make a decision that is less than fully arbitrary. If one assumes again that criterion 1, agreement, is the most reliable, one can usually identify a subject. Gestern yesterday. Word was. Newer only. Geschlafen, slept. Yet another type of construction that challenges the subject concept is locative inversion, e.g. 1. Spiders have been breeding under the bed. 2. Under the bed have been breeding spiders. Locative inversion. 3. Where have been breeding spiders? Failed attempt to question the location. 4. Where have spiders been breeding? Successful attempt to question the location. The criteria easily identify spiders as the subject in sentence 1. In sentence 2, however, the position occupied suggests that under the bed should be construed as the subject, whereas agreement and semantic role continue to identify spiders as the subject. This is despite the fact that spiders in sentence 2 appears after the string of verbs in the canonical position of an object. The fact that sentence 3 is bad but sentence 4 is good reveals that something unusual is indeed afoot, since the attempt to question the location fails if the subject does not immediately follow the finite verb. This further observation speaks against taking spiders as the subject in sentence 2. But if spiders is not the subject, then the sentence must lack a subject entirely. The existence of subject-less clauses can be construed as particularly problematic for theories of sentence structure that build on the binary subject-predicate division. A simple sentence is defined as the combination of a subject and a predicate, but if no subject is present, how can one have a sentence? Subject-less clauses are absent from English for the most part, but they are not unusual in related languages. In German, for instance, impersonal passive clauses can lack a recognizable subject, e.g. Everybody slept yesterday. The word gestern yesterday is generally construed as an adverb, which means it cannot be taken as a subject in this sentence. Certain verbs in German also require a dative or accusative object instead of a nominative subject, e.g. Subject-less clauses. Jade went. Falb. Leaving. I am uneasy about it. Since subjects are typically marked by the nominative case in German, the fourth criterion above, one can argue that this sentence lacks a subject, for the relevant verb argument appears in the dative case, not in the nominative. Impersonal sentences in Scottish Gaelic can occasionally have a very similar form to the first German example where an actor is omitted. In the following sentence, the word, jade, went, is an auxiliary carrying tense and is used in an impersonal or passive constructions. The word, falb, leaving, is a verbal noun. Everybody left. The subject receives a privileged status in theories of sentence structure. In those approaches that acknowledge the binary division of the clause into a subject and a predicate, as is the case in most phrase-structured grammars, the subject is usually an immediate dependent of the root node, whereby its sister is the predicate. The object, in contrast, appears lower in the structure as a dependent of a verb, e.g. 10. Subjects are indicated using blue, and objects using orange. The special status of the subject is visible insofar as the subject is higher in the tree each time than the object. In theories of syntax that reject the initial division, as is the case in most dependency grammars, the subject is nevertheless also granted a privileged status insofar as it is an immediate dependent of the finite verb. The following trees are those of a dependency grammar. 11. Subjects in sentence structure. The subject is a dependent of the root node, the finite verb, in both trees. The object, in contrast, appears lower in the second tree, where it is a dependent of the non-finite verb. The subject remains a dependent finite verb when subject auxiliary inversion occurs. The prominence of the subject is consistently reflected in its position in the tree as an immediate dependent of the root word, the finite verb. See also